When we get later in the Bible and when we get into the New Testament, we can be more certain down to the certain year, but we may be hundreds of years off on some of our chronology in the Old Testament, and I'll tell you why a little bit later. But nonetheless, it would be before the death of Moses that many think around 1500 BC. So it had to be written before that, but exactly when it was written, we don't know. Now, what about the time period that's covered? Well, we really don't know how old the earth is. The Bible argues for a young earth. But how old is it? Is it 6,000, 8,000 years old? Conservative scholars are at variance over that. I'm following Klassen's chronology, Frank Klassen's chronology. Not because I think he's exactly right, but it gives me kind of a perspective. I'm not really concerned whether this date of 3975 BC is the date of creation, but it does give me kind of a perspective that and I'll give some dates along. When we come down, for example, to Abraham, I'll give you a date. This is where he fits, so you can kind of compare how long has that been since creation, supposedly. And you find a chronology that varies from that, then okay, don't worry too much about that because I'm not either. But if that be the case, Joseph thought to be around 1606 BC, and that's the end of the book of Genesis. So he's covering about 2,369 years. Well, J. Sidlow Baxter says it covers the history of man for the first 2,500 years. Now, what's amazing about that is, if you were living at the time of Joseph, and you look back to Adam, that's just a little more than the distance from us to Christ. You stop and think about that. From us to Christ seems like a long time ago. But when we get down to Joseph, you're not thinking that's 2,500 years since Adam. So we're covering about 2,500 years real quickly. Make sense? That kind of gives you a perspective of what we're doing. So what's the message of the book? Well, the message of the book has to do with the name means origin or beginnings. It's the beginning of how God built a nation through whom the Messiah would come. So when we get through with Genesis, and we see that God built a nation through whom the Messiah would come, then we've got the message of Genesis, though there's much more to it than that. Now here's some beginnings that we see in Genesis. We see the beginning of life. We see the beginning of man. We see the beginning of a covenant. This is the first covenant. The beginning of marriage, the beginning of home, beginning of family problems and sibling disputes, the beginning of sin, the beginning of the plan of redemption, the first promise of that, Genesis chapter 3, that's next week. The beginning of crime, the first murder. The beginning of worship, chapter 4. The beginning of the nations. Where did all the nations come from? Here where we have that in chapters 10 and 11. The beginning of the Hebrew nation, chapters 12 to 50. So this is the beginning. This is where it all starts right here. Make sense? All right, let's go to question 1 now. What kind of outline did you find of the book of Genesis? Kind of a summary of the book itself. It would naturally divide at what point? Just a cursory reading through Genesis, when you go through Genesis, it's kind of like Hebrews. Hebrews just has a natural fall. You just can't help but, if you took the book of Genesis and broke it like a candy bar, it's going to break between chapters 9 and 10. It's just got to. And so if you took the book of Genesis and you broke it, where's it going to break naturally? I'm sorry? Exactly between 11 and 12. All right, so here's what we have in chapters 1 through 11. This is a natural break. This is not a forced break. We have early history, chapters 1 through 11. We have creation. This is a very brief outline, very brief. You have creation, chapters 1 and 2, the fall of man, 3 and 4, the flood, 5 to 9, the Tower of Babel, 10 through 11. You say, is there not more in that? Well, yeah, there's a whole lot more, but that's a good summary of early history. And so we start with creation, and the camera angle widens out so that we see the whole broad picture of the beginning of the nations. And now at chapter 12, we have the patriarchal history, and here we zero in on one nation. Now, you have the chosen family, chapters 12 to 38. You have Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph. And we're not through with Joseph when we get to 37. We have the whole story of Joseph is not just an interesting story about a man who's pure and lived good and good life, but it's the descent into Egypt. And what's God doing in Egypt? He's already built the nation. What's he doing now? He's protecting and preserving the nation. So God builds a nation, he preserves a nation. He's going to warn a nation. He's going to help that nation all along. But early history and patriarchal history, if you don't have all of that down, you'll get that later. We're going to see that every time. All right, let's go to question number 2. Short summary of chapter 1. What's chapter 1 about? Creation. The beginning. The 6 days of creation. So let's go through chapter 1. Here is an outline of chapter 1. It's 6 days of creation. This again is a natural division through the chapter. And so we have the first day, the second, third, fourth, fifth, and sixth. So we're all familiar with creation, but let's get the picture and we'll make some comments as we go along. And hopefully some things that'll help you, even though you may already know that, some of the evidence I'll try to give all through Genesis is how to deal with the skeptic. The one who believes Genesis is a myth, or I'm more interested in brethren who have argued against Genesis, and we'll talk more about that as we go on here, starting with verse 4 in a moment. So anyway, in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth. Now verses 1 to 5 deals with the first day of creation. What takes place on the first day? God created light. First of all, verse 2, the earth was without form and void. Chaos. It was without form and void. Darkness was on the face of the deep, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the face of the waters. I don't want to take a lot of time on the Spirit's role here, but the Father had a role in creating the universe. The Son was the agent through whom that was done. Colossians 1, John 1, and Hebrews 1. Those 3 chapters, I'm not going to give you the verses because I don't have them on my mind. Look them up. But anyway, Hebrews 1, 3, and Colossians 1, 16 and 17, and John 1, 3, I think. But anyway, John 1, Hebrews 1, and Colossians 1 talks about the Son being the agent through whom that was done. But the Spirit had a role. What role did he play? Well, this verse is one of the few, if any, if maybe the only verse that tells us what he was doing. And it seemed to have the organizing effect. What does that mean? I've told you about all I know on that. But it seemed that in response to the earth being without form and void, the Spirit was moving upon the face of the earth, doing something, seemingly an organizing effect. But anyway, the text says, God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. And what was God's reaction to that? It was good. With everything God said, and the result thereof, God either said it was good, or the text says it was so. So it was good or it was so. It didn't begin and develop, as evolution says, but it was good or it was so. And the light he called day, the darkness he called night, and the evening and the morning were the first day. Now let's stop and talk just for a moment about the day, whether it's a 24-hour period or eons of time, just briefly, and let's give you brief evidence of that. Some of our own brethren have argued that a day here is millions of years in length. And what they're trying to do is take the Genesis account, harmonize it with evolution. Evolution requires not millions, but billions of years. It takes a long, long time for evolution to work. So their argument is that each day is millions or perhaps billions of years in length. So day 1 is a long, 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 long time, and so is day 2, and so is day 3, and day 4, and day 5. Others have said, no. Day 1 is 24 hours, and then there's billions of years between that and the next 24-hour period. So, but the text says evening and morning were the first day. A basic rule of biblical hermeneutics, or any hermeneutics for that matter, the science of interpretation, is you take a word as it normally is used and it has its ordinary meaning unless the text indicates otherwise, context. There is nothing to indicate it means otherwise. Let me give you 2 passages that tell me the 6 days here is a normal work week. Let's go over to Exodus 20. You might make a note in the margin of your text. Exodus 20. Verses 8 through 10. When God said, "Remember the Sabbath day and keep it holy," he said, 6 days shall you labor and do your work, but the 7th day you shall rest. For the Jew, he was to work 6 days and rest on the 7th. That was his 7-day week. For, verse 11, in 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth and the sea, and all that is in them, and rested on the seventh. There was a parallel between the work week of the Jew and the 6 days of creation, adding then the seventh as the day of rest. Let me give you one more reference. Makes the same point. And you say, well, this is quite simple. We'll tell you. When we battled with this at around the year 2000 among brethren, and there was a battle around 2000, 2001, 99, 2000, 2001, there was a battle among brethren. This is the passage we kept going to and pointing that out time and again. Exodus 31, 17, Exodus 31, verse 15 and following. That, again, I'm not going to develop the point, but the work week of the Jew was compared to the week of creation. So that's evidence that this is a literal 6 days, making 1 week, 24 hours followed by 24 hours, followed by 24 hours, followed by 24 hours, etc. Make sense? All right. And we can say more about that, but we're going to leave that alone. The second day now, what happens on the second day? Verses 6 to 8. All right. Let there be a firmament or the expanse. Some translations will say sky, the space. And so God divided the waters that were above the firmament from the waters that were below the firmament. So what was that? I don't know. It very well could be cloud formation that's developed here, but some have suggested, and for good reason, that there may have been a vapor canopy over the earth, that God separated that, and that was part of the way in which perhaps God brought the flood upon the earth a little bit later. But whatever the case may be, I'm not going to pursue that much further, other than that God separated the waters from above the firmament and that which is below the firmament, the expanse or the space, and he said it was good. The third day, what did he do? All right, he divided the water from the land, and he said, let the dry land appear, and the land he called he called earth, and the waters he called the seas, and he said it was good. And then he said, let the earth bring forth grass, and herbs, and fruit, and it was so. You might underline, it was so, and it was good, all through this context. And then verse 12, that there was to be trees that would yield fruit. We'll see more about that fruit in a moment, whose seed is in itself according to its kind, and God saw that it was good, and evening, morning were the third day. Now we're at the third day. So now we have the dividing of the waters from the land, the grass, the plants, and the trees. Now, day 4, what do we have? The stars and the moon and the sun. Let there be lights in the firmament of the heavens to divide the day from the night, and let them be for signs and for seasons and for years. So at verse 14, when he said, let there be light, that means that this was not already there. Let there be lights in the firmament to divide the day from the night, and from the, let it be for signs. Verse 15, let the lights be in the firmament to give light on the earth, and it was so. So he made 2 great lights, one to rule the day and one to rule the night. That's the sun and the moon. And then he made the stars also, the text says. Verse 18, what do you learn from verse 18? The greater light was to rule over, or one light was to rule over the night, and the to divide the light from the darkness, and God indeed saw that it was good. And evening, morning were the 4th day. All right, let's go to the 5th day. I'm driving down to the 6th day, and then we're ready to tie some things from chapter 2 in interest of time. What happens on the 5th day? Yeah, the birds and the sea creatures. And so let the waters bring forth an abundance of living creatures. And let the birds fly across the firmament. There's our somewhat of a definition of the firmament. So God created sea creatures and winged creatures and told them to be fruitful and multiply and fill the waters and fill the earth, and fill the air, and the evening and the morning were the fifth day. Now, the sixth day was quite a busy day. What happens on the sixth day? 24 to 31. All right? He creates man. But even prior to that, he created the cattle and the beast, every living thing. And then he said, let us make man in our image, plural terms, referring to the Godhead, the Father, the Son, and the Spirit. Let us create man. Let us make man in our image after our likeness. And what's he going to do with man? Yeah, he's going to give him dominion over the earth, over the fish, over the cattle, over all the earth, and over every creeping thing. In his own image, he created him. He blessed him, and he said, be fruitful and multiply and replenish, and subdue the earth, and have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the fowls of the air, and over everything that moves. Now, let's stop there, and we'll get 29 through 31 in a moment. What do you learn from that? All right, yeah, God has provided all that for us. Interesting. I want to come back to whether or not that could be used for food just yet in a moment. But I want to come back to what Stephen is saying. God did provide that for food, but that's not told here yet. What does he tell about? It's something that is in the political climate all the time. Animal rights. Animals don't have rights. How do I know? Yes. It doesn't mean you abuse animals. What that means, though, is that man has rule and dominion over the animals. He has power over the animals. He rules over the fish. He rules over the cattle. Rules over the birds of the air. And so all the thing of saving the planet and trying to save all the animals, and let's not shoot the animals and kill them to eat them because we're not supposed to do that. Man has dominion, the text says, over the animals, over the birds of the air and the fish of the sea. Now, what's interesting, and I hadn't thought about this till this study, as many times as this is part of the value of going through these studies over and over, you see something you didn't see before. And if we did, I forgot about it. At this juncture, I want us to finish 29, 30, and 31, and notice that permission to eat the meat's not yet given. It's going to be given later, and I'll give you the reference in a moment. But let's see. Look at verse 29. I have given you the herbs that yield the seed, which is on the face of the earth, and every tree that yields fruit to you to be for food. He hadn't said a thing about the animals. You rule over them, but hadn't said you eat them yet, has he? And every beast of the earth, and every bird of the air, etc. And every green herb is for food, verse 30. And it was so. And God saw that he had made everything. Indeed, it was very good. And the evening and the morning were the sixth day. Might make a marginal note. It's not until chapter 9 and in verse 3 that God said, every moving thing shall be for food, and I have given you even the green herbs. Now, there may be another reference in there that I've missed, but I hadn't thought much about that till this study, that there was nothing said about eating those animals until we get a little bit later. There may be a reference between there and 9, but I don't remember it, and we'll find it as we go through, and we'll watch for that. So I may stand corrected on that, but I think that's where the permission is given over in chapter 9. All right, now, this is a survey, so if anybody's going through this for the first time, this is kind of a quick pace. We recognize that, but this is a survey. It's not a detailed study, but what we're trying to do is get the gist of what Genesis 1 is about. We have the 6 days of creation, and here's what took place on each one of those days. Back to question number 2. Summary of chapter 2. All right, the detailed account of the creation of man. Genesis 2 doesn't follow in sequence and a continuation from, now part of it does, the seventh day obviously does, but it's not what God continues to do beyond the seventh day, but it goes back and explains much of what took place on the sixth day. Make sense? That's what we find in chapter 2. So let's see what chapter 2 is about here, and let's work our way through that. I call it simply man in the garden. And we have the creation, is finished, and God rested on the seventh day, verses 1 to 7. And then we'll see man in the garden. We'll come back to man in the garden in a moment. But let's talk about the seventh day now. The heavens and the earth and all the host of them were finished, the text says. And on the seventh day, God rested. I'm sorry, I lost my place here. Okay, yeah, verse 2. And on the seventh day, God ended his work, and he rested on the seventh day from all the work that he had done. Again, here's the past tense. God had done, it was good, it was so. There's just numerous references all through chapter 1 and 2 of God having finished his work. If you want to make a marginal note, Psalm 33, verses 6 to 9, makes the point that God spoken and it was done. It stood fast. Instantaneous creation. God never started something that then evolved, but God spoken and it was done. When God said, let there be light, boom, there's light. When God said, let the earth bring forth grass, grass came forth. When God created man, let us make man, boom, there's man. It was instantaneous, Psalm 33. Now, at verse 3, there's something else that I hadn't thought much about to this time. That God blessed the seventh day and sanctified it, because in it he rested from all his work which he had created and made. I may be wrong about this, so I'm not, but it seems like that, let me back up to what I thought the passage was saying before. It really doesn't make a big difference here. It's just more of a little shade of a difference. But I thought the text was saying that God hallowed the seventh day by resting on that. And that may be what the text is saying. By resting on the seventh day, he hallowed that day. But it very well may be saying, from the standpoint of Moses writing at the time he writes, and at the time he's writing, that's beyond the Sabbath being instituted on Sinai. So if we could put ourselves on the other side of Sinai, and from Moses' vantage point of writing, it was in Exodus 20 where God hallowed it, because God had rested on that day. Does that make sense? He made it a special day. That seems like that's what he's saying. And you say you disagree, I'm not going to argue that. But I think that makes sense to me, and I just throw that out for what that's worth. You say, well, no, I think he hallowed it back there in the creation. Okay, maybe he did. I wonder if this is not written from the vantage point of Moses looking back on the other side of Sinai, for what that might be worth. Anyway, now let's get down through verse 7. We don't have a great deal of time because we want to work through the rest of this. Verse 4 said, this is the history of the heavens and the earth. God created before any plant of the field was in the earth, and before any herb of the field was grown, for the Lord had not caused it to rain, and there was no man to till the ground, but a mist went up from the whole earth and watered the face of the ground. We just learned something. What did we learn? About dew? All right. God caused a mist before there's rain, before there was any rain. Rain is not. So we've got 6 days of creation here, or we're up to the sixth day now, retelling the story in chapter 2. Hadn't been any rain on the earth. That's one of the things that tells me these are 24-hour periods. Because when you have the grass, let's back up and you talk about the grass being created and the trees on the third day, millions and millions and millions of years, and there hadn't been a drop of rain. That's not going to work too well. But it would last for a while, until a day or two, until there is rain. But God had caused a mist. That's how God watered the earth, is through this mist. Yes, I think you're right. I think you're right. And we'll come into that, not next week, but the following week, I think. We'll get into that. Good point. Verse 7 talks about what God did on that sixth day, and he formed man of the dust of the ground. We weren't told that in chapter 1. The details are given here. He formed man out of the dust of the ground. In other words, he didn't form him from another animal. He didn't take another animal and transform him into a human being, but he took the dust of the ground and he made man, and he breathed into his nostrils the breath of life, and man became a living being. Your translation of the King James will say he became a living soul. The Bible uses the term soul sometimes to refer to man's immortality, his spirit, but sometimes the life that's in the body. Here I think he's talking about life. This is not talking about him having an immortal soul. This is talking about breathing into him life. He became a living being. You say, well, where's the soul mentioned? I think that's in the image of God, chapter 1:26. We've already seen that. 1 Thessalonians 5 will give us some insight to that. Now, let's start with chapter 2 and verse 8 following. Let's talk about man in the garden. Let's see the description of the garden in verses 8 to 14. We'll come about in just a moment the location of that garden, or where some think it is. We really don't know. And we're going to put Evan on the spot back there. He's just taught geography for a year, so he ought to know where the garden is, and we're going to ask him in a minute. Anyway, we'll get to that here in a second. Beginning at verse 8 through 14, what we see in the description of the garden. All right, there's God had put trees in there. Verse 9 mentions there was every tree that was pleasant for food. The tree of life was there in the midst of the garden, and the tree of knowledge of good and evil. Now, we could spend the rest of our time and all of next week, too, talking about the tree of knowledge, the tree of life and the tree of knowledge of good and evil. And there's all kinds of theories. If you have 10 commentaries, you'll probably have 10 different theories on what those are about. Some think they're the same tree. I don't think so. They seem to be distinct. But it seems that God placed a tree representative of, was it a little tree? Yeah, I think it was a little tree. It's called the tree of life. Called the tree of life, some have thought that means it's tree of life because it's a living tree. Well, all the trees were living, so I don't think that's what he's talking about. But it seemed, let's get to chapter 3 and in verse 22. This gives us some insight. God said that man has become as one of us to know good and evil because he ate of the tree of knowledge of good and evil, by the way. And let us put him out of, I've lost my place. Where am I? Verse 22. To know good and evil, and now, lest he put out his hand and take also of the tree of life and eat and live forever. This was a tree of which if you partook, then there is life that comes from that. That's why it's called the tree of life. You say, explain all that to me. I can't. If you can, then the floor is yours. I don't know how to explain all of that, but there was a tree that's called the tree of life from which if you ate, then you would live. There was another tree from which you would gain knowledge. And you say, how do you know? Because that's what chapter 3:22 just told me. Man had eaten of that and he'd gained knowledge. And if he ate of this tree of life, he would gain life. Apologetics Press has an article that they talk about the tree of knowledge of good and evil versus the tree of life. Not that they were merely representative trees, but they did represent that here was the choice of life. And while this one offered knowledge, it also had the penalty of death. And man from the beginning had been given the choice of life or death. And man was made a free moral agent. You can eat of this tree or eat of that tree. I told you not to eat of this one, but you make your choice. And man made his choice. Make sense? Chapter 3 is going to give us some insight, I think, to the tree of life and the tree of knowledge of good and evil. Now, at verse 10 through 14, it tells us the location of the garden. It tells us these rivers at verse 13. And there is a question as to whether it is at the northern part of this Fertile Crescent or down here toward the, this is one location, possible location. Others think it's down here in the Sumer location close to the Persian Sea. But most suggest we really don't know exactly. Comments, Evan? Sounds good. By the way, the scholarly thing today is to say we don't know. So, yeah, Evan and I both will appear as scholars. We don't know. No one knows for sure. And it's not important that we know for sure. But those are two locations that are thought. Some have suggested a third location, which we don't have time to get into, but those are two of the locations that have been historically identified. I'm more interested in what took place in the garden. Verse 15, God put him there, and what did he put him there to do? Take care of it and tend the garden. Verse 16 and 17, what do we have? Yes. Here's the law. This is, by the way, the first covenant. If you want to mark down some first things, we have the first man already created. We haven't seen the first woman yet. But we have the first law, or the first covenant that is made. And here's the first covenant that God issued. Of every tree of the garden you may freely eat, but of the tree of knowledge of good and evil you may not eat, for in the day that you eat of it you will surely die. Now, was there something about this fruit that was poisonous? I don't think that's the point. You eat of this tree, and therefore it's going to contaminate you, and you're going to die. That's not the point. But God has just simply given a law that this is a tree of knowledge of good and evil. There was something to be gained by eating that. There was something attractive by eating that. Keep in mind, there is no such thing as death at this point until they eat of that tree. So the tree of life is not as appealing to them, is it? Would be to me, because there's death all around. But this is what's appealing. And we'll say more about that next week. Now, verse 17, but of the tree of knowledge of good and evil, in the day that you eat of it, you will surely die. So in what sense would they die? All right, they're going to lose their innocence. Spiritually and physically. Because from this point, chapter 3, I say this point, next week, chapter 3, man not only is separated from God, and that's the first instance of sin that separates man from God, but it was because of that sin that man dies physically, is it not? 1 Corinthians 15. For as in Adam all die. More about that a little bit later. Any questions on, this is just a summation of man in the garden is all we're seeing in chapter 2, the summation. Here's the description of the garden. It was a beautiful garden. Had trees in the garden. There was 2 particular trees that are there. Man was to work in the garden, and God gave him a law. It's pretty simple. You can stay in this garden, you can live in this garden, you can have everything in here, but you can't eat of this tree, and y'all have at it and have a good time. And they went for the tree that was forbidden, as we're going to see in chapter 3. But we don't know that yet. We haven't seen that yet. Yes. Yes, and if he didn't, then the law means nothing. The law is meaningless. So I think that's correct in assuming that Adam understands, but how does he understand that? I don't know. I don't know. You know, I think Adam is a full-grown human being, so he's not having to grow up and learn and be taught. So I think there is some knowledge that he has from the beginning he knew about animals. He knew how to name them. He didn't have to be taught to speak and to talk. So it's what God has put in him that from that point on, his children grow up and they learn that. But I'm assuming that he then has a knowledge of what death is. Now, and another point about all of this, not only that question, but anything that we're going to come across, the whole Bible is written from a summary standpoint, by the way. Obviously, this is not what we're going to see in 18 through 20 in a moment, is not the whole discussion of the creation of woman, surely. There's more to it than this. But this is all God needed to tell us. So maybe there was a session where God explained to him what death is. That you're going to be separated from me and that you no longer can live, that you'll, I don't know. Very well may be. But how that's true, I don't know. All right. Good point. Let's get 18 to 25, and then we'll be done. 18 to 25 is the creation of woman. Now, this takes place on the 6th day. How do I know that? It doesn't identify it as a 6th day. Because God rested on the 7th day. And if he was creating woman on the 7th day, then he didn't rest. And if it was on the 8th day or the 10th or the 13th day, then this is not the all of creation in 6 days, then is it? So I know this takes place in that he created man on the 6th day. That same day, he created woman. Now let's get the picture. God saw that it was not good that man should be alone. So he'll make a helper comparable to him. King James uses the word help meet. It's a helper meet, meaning suitable. We often quote that she's a helpmeet. That's not really what it's saying. It's saying a help that is meet. We don't normally use that term. Comparable or compatible to him. That's the idea. So, in order to show to Adam that he needed something more, God did what? Called Adam and brought all the animals before him, and he saw, and I'm going to have to go through this quickly because we're about 2 minutes away, that he named them all, but he didn't find anything compatible to him. Nothing comparable to him. Nothing to have a companion for him. So God caused a deep sleep to come up on Adam and took one of his ribs, and he closed up the flesh. First surgery, by the way. And he took the rib and took it from man and made a woman and brought her to man. And Adam said, this is my bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh. She should be called woman because she was taken from man. That's the idea of woman. She is taken from man. Make sense? That's why she's called woman. That doesn't fit with modern liberal left thought. Now, there's much discussion about verse 24. Is this Adam speaking or is this God speaking? And I take it as God speaking. And you may think this was Adam's words, and your translation may quote it. Mine quotes it and sets Adam's statement off in italics, and then here is seemingly God speaking here. Or it may be, when I say God speaking, it's God speaking through Moses, as Moses pens this, is what I think. So it's God speaking through Moses. This is Moses' comment, I think. But you may think this is still a quotation from Adam. Do with it what you wish. But anyway, verse 24, therefore shall man leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife, and they become one flesh. Now, we'll come back to verse 25 if time permits, but let's go to a question. Where is that quoted in the New Testament? Question number 6a. Matthew 19, 4-6, and where else? Mark 10, where else? Ephesians 5:31 is where that is quoted. This is God's eternal law on marriage. This is God's eternal law. Jesus bases his teaching on Genesis 2. And so what do we learn from that? What was the point Jesus drove home in Mark and in Matthew? From the beginning was not so. He drove home the permanence of marriage. When the question was asked, can a man divorce his wife just for any reason? His answer was, have you not read? You should know from reading Genesis 2 that you can't divorce just for any reason. Now, verse 25, let's conclude this. They were both naked. You might write the word nude out to the side, not trying to be graphic, but we're going to make a point in chapter 3. The Bible uses the term naked in multiple ways. Here it is nude. There's no clothes. And you say, how do you know? Because they try to clothe themselves later. So they're nude here. And there is no shame. Have you thought about why there's no shame? Later they are. They don't know. Number one, they're innocent. There's no need for shame. There's no sin. There's no sin at all. Not until chapter 3. We haven't come to that yet. So there's no sin. And there is no need for shame. They are shamed a little bit later. But they were both naked and they were not ashamed. Again, you might write the word nude out because we're going to make a play on that term naked as the Bible uses that we might come to a better understanding. Chapters 3-5, if you didn't get questions, they're up here on the front. And anyway, anytime that you don't have questions, if you have access to email, I can email those to you if you'll just let me know.